I can still feel the tremor of that morning, the vibration that ran through the steel hull of the Akagi when the rising sun flag was raised high above the deck. The sky was clear, the sea calm, and the air heavy with triumph. We had done it. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, and the Empire of Japan stood taller than it ever had in its 4,000 years of history. The men around me shouted, "Banzai!" until their throats turned raw. Mechanics banged wrenches against the bulkheads. Pilots lifted their flight helmets like trophies. Even the usually reserved officers smiled that day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had become a legend overnight. His words, whispered among us before the operation, now echoed like prophecy. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, I can run wild. At the time, we took that as a promise of total dominance. None of us imagined the other half of his warning, that after 6 months, he feared what America would become. We didn't understand what he meant then. We thought he doubted Japan. We were wrong. He understood the storm we had just awakened. From the observation deck, I could see the flight crews moving with machine-like precision. The smell of oil and salt mixed with the faint sweetness of Sakura soap from home, still lingering on the sailors' uniforms. We believed ourselves invincible. Our carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, were the sharp edge of the Empire's sword. We had rewritten naval warfare. Battleships were relics. The sky now ruled the ocean. I remember writing in my journal that night, "We have entered a new era, the age of the carrier." I believed it with all my heart. When I looked at the Admiral standing on the bridge, his uniform immaculate, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon, I felt I was in the presence of destiny itself. He didn't speak often, but when he did, every word carried the weight of command. "Do not mistake victory for invulnerability," he said quietly once. Most ignored him. We were too drunk on glory. The celebrations went on for days. Newspapers in Tokyo printed headlines of divine triumph. School children sang songs about the brave airmen who had humbled America. Mothers wept tears of pride. But on the Akagi, when the laughter finally faded, I couldn't stop thinking about the pilots who hadn't returned, the empty bunks, the cooling teacups left untouched. We said they had become spirits of the sea, honored by the Emperor himself. Yet when I stared out into the endless Pacific that night, I felt something else entirely. It was as if the ocean, beneath its glittering surface, was hiding something vast and patient, something that was waiting. And though I couldn't name it then, I would soon learn its true face. Not the enemy's flag, but the arrogance that blinds a nation drunk on its own power. Weeks after the celebration, I was assigned to a reconnaissance flight over Oahu. The official order described it as a simple survey of enemy recovery efforts. But the truth was different. Yamamoto wanted to see the full extent of our triumph with his own eyes. I remember standing beside the pilot as our aircraft lifted off from the deck of the Akagi, the sun rising behind us like a blood-red coin. The ocean stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent, until the black scars of Pearl Harbor appeared on the horizon. At first, I thought the smoke was still rising, but it was only mist, clinging to the wreckage like ghosts. Below us, the harbor was a graveyard. Battleships lay split open like carcasses, twisted steel ribs jutting from the water. The USS Arizona still bled oil into the sea, thick, black trails drifting like ink over the waves. Around it, smaller boats moved aimlessly, their decks crowded with men searching for bodies that would never be found. I could see scorched uniforms, lifeless arms dangling over the rails. It was victory, yes, but it did not look like glory. I told myself this was war, that the destruction we caused was necessary to secure the Empire's future. Yet as I stared through the glass, I couldn't shake a heavy silence that filled my chest. The American flag still fluttered over a ruined dock, half-burned but still standing. It shouldn't have meant anything, and yet it did. Something in me whispered that we hadn't destroyed their will, only tested it. When we landed, the officers congratulated us on a successful observation. The photographs were passed around like trophies. Everyone smiled as they pointed at the shattered hulls and counted the confirmed kills. But that night, alone in my cabin, I stared at the prints under the dim light. I could see faces in the wreckage, illusions perhaps, but faces nonetheless. Men who had eaten, laughed, and written letters home just as we did. I felt a sickness I couldn't name. In Tokyo, the newspapers called Pearl Harbor the Divine Thunderstrike. Radio programs declared that America had been broken. But anyone who had seen that harbor up close knew it was a lie. We hadn't broken them. We had awakened them. The giant we thought we had slain was only wounded, and the wound was teaching it to fight. That night, the sea was quiet again. I stood on the deck of the Akagi, looking east toward that sleeping giant across the ocean. The stars reflected off the water like embers. For the first time, I wondered if our victory was truly the beginning of Japan's glory, or the spark that would one day burn us all. May 1942. The sea was restless, even before the first bombs fell. The crew of the Akagi moved like clockwork, their faces lit by the cold light of dawn. We had been ordered south, to a place most of us had never heard of, the Coral Sea. The radio crackled with intercepted transmissions, the coded chatter of American carriers. We had dominated the Pacific for months, and yet there was unease in the air. This time, the enemy had ships of their own, carriers like ours. For the first time, the sky would decide everything. When the first reports arrived, we gathered around the communication table. The Shokaku had taken heavy damage, the Zuikaku was barely afloat. The Shoho, our light carrier, was gone, sunk within minutes. The men spoke the name in silence, as if saying it aloud would make it sink again. The radio officer muttered, "Shoho wa monai, the Shoho burns." Then, nothing but static. For the first time, Japan's naval code for victory, Tora, was silent. I remember watching the horizon from the observation post. Black plumes of smoke curled into the sky, blending with the clouds. The pilots who returned landed their Zeros in silence, eyes hollow, hands trembling. One of them, Lieutenant Mori, stared straight ahead and whispered, "They never even saw us." His wingman was gone, shot down by an enemy he couldn't find. We had always fought battleship against battleship, man against man. But this was something else. We were fighting shadows. In the mess hall that night, no one celebrated. The officers' quarters were filled with whispers. Some said the Americans had developed radar, a device that could see through clouds, smoke, even night. Others said it was luck. I didn't believe in luck. I believed in learning. And the Americans were learning faster than we expected. When we finally withdrew, Tokyo called Coral Sea a victory. They said we had sunk more tonnage than the enemy, that the path to Port Moresby was still open. But the truth was in the faces of the wounded. The smell of burnt oil clung to our uniforms. We had lost men, planes, and, though no one dared admit it, our certainty. As I wrote my report that night, I realized something had changed in the rhythm of the war. It was no longer a contest of courage or honor. It had become a race between those who adapted and those who clung to old glory. And for the first time, I feared that Japan, proud and unyielding, might not be the one to win it. The summons came in the middle of the night, carried by an officer whose face was carved in stone. The red stamp on the envelope said it all, Imperial Directive. Every man on the Akagi knew what that meant. Something enormous was coming. We gathered in the navigation room before sunrise. The air smelled of ink, salt, and tension. Captain Aoki unrolled a map of the Pacific across the table. His finger landed on a tiny speck of coral barely visible amid the blue expanse, Midway Atoll. "The Americans will defend this point with all they have left," he said. "And that is exactly why we will crush them there." A murmur spread through the officers. Midway was small, insignificant to the eye, but to Yamamoto it was the key to the Pacific. Control Midway, and the path to Hawaii would open. Destroy their carriers, and the United States would kneel at the negotiation table. It sounded simple, elegant, even. But beneath the calm voices and meticulous plans, I could feel something unnatural, overconfidence disguised as destiny. We were told that the enemy fleet was scattered, disorganized after Coral Sea. Intelligence insisted their morale was broken, their pilots untrained. "They will come to defend Midway," said the intelligence officer, "but they won't be ready." I remember exchanging a glance with Lieutenant Mori. Neither of us spoke, but the thought was the same. We had heard this before. Preparations began immediately. Every plane on the Akagi was inspected, repainted, and loaded with new ordnance. The mechanics worked through the night, their faces shining with sweat and pride. Pilots rehearsed takeoffs until dawn, their engines roaring like gods of thunder. Yamamoto himself sent a message to the fleet. This will be the decisive battle that secures the Empire for 1,000 years. Those words echoed through the corridors like scripture. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that Pearl Harbor had been the opening act and that Midway would be the grand finale. But as I looked at the map, that tiny island surrounded by endless ocean, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. The Americans had failed before, yes, but they had also survived. And a wounded enemy that survives does not forget. When the final orders were issued, we raised anchor under a blood-red dawn. The drums of the fleet thundered across the waves, and banners of the rising sun rippled proudly in the wind. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the rhythm of marching feet and engines, I felt a whisper that no one else seemed to hear. It said, quietly but clearly, "You are sailing toward your own grave." The Akagi cut through the Pacific like a blade of steel. The sky was clear, the wind steady, the kind of calm that makes even the most faithful sailor uneasy. We sailed in formation with the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Navy. 4 floating fortresses, each carrying the finest pilots in Japan. The decks gleamed under the morning sun, and every man aboard believed we were untouchable. The radio filled with coded chatter, brief and confident. The Empire moved as one, unaware that the circle was already closing around us. I stood at the observation deck, scanning the horizon through my binoculars. Nothing but blue, sea and sky, endless and perfect. Yet something about that emptiness felt wrong. Our intelligence claimed the American fleet was scattered, disorganized, maybe even retreating. But the ocean has its own language, and that morning it whispered a warning. The gulls were gone. The waves broke differently, in slow, deliberate rhythms, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. At the morning briefing, Captain Aoki read from the coded dispatches sent by Yamamoto's flagship. The plan was precise, mathematical. We would strike Midway from the northwest, while a second task force waited to ambush the Americans when they came to defend it. Everything was planned to perfection. Everything, except for the possibility that they already knew. Lieutenant Mori leaned toward me as the briefing ended. "They're too quiet," he said. "If I were the enemy, I'd be waiting." I wanted to dismiss it, to believe in the brilliance of Yamamoto's plan, but Mori's words clung to me like a cold wind. Later, as the engines roared to life, I passed the radio room and saw the operators working frantically. They were decoding fragments of intercepted transmissions, faint, fragmented signals in English. I caught one word through the static, AF. It meant nothing to me then. But later, I would learn that AF was our own code for Midway, and that the Americans had been listening the entire time. By sunset, the fleet steamed forward under a crimson sky. The men joked, laughed, smoked. They said the Americans would crumble as they always had. But when I looked at the horizon, I saw only darkness creeping in, not the enemy's fleet, but our own shadow, stretching longer by the hour. That night, I wrote in my logbook, "We sail with confidence, but the sea hides secrets no man can command." I didn't know it yet, but somewhere beyond that horizon, the Americans were already waiting, patient, silent, and ready to close the trap we had built for ourselves. We reached Midway on the morning of June 3rd. The island looked small, almost harmless, a pale ring of sand lost in an endless blue desert. From the Akagi's bridge, it seemed absurd that such a place could decide the fate of empires. The sea was calm, the wind steady, and the officers around me were relaxed. Some even laughed. We had arrived on schedule, undetected, just as the plan dictated. The confidence that had carried us since Pearl Harbor still burned bright. But beneath it, something, instinct perhaps, told me that the horizon was lying. Shortly after dawn, the first alarm came. Enemy aircraft sighted, approaching from the east. We rushed to stations, but the tension lasted only minutes. The American bombers were clumsy, uncoordinated, and most of their payloads splashed harmlessly into the sea. The gunners cheered, the bridge erupted in laughter, and someone shouted, "Is this all the mighty America can do?" Even the captain smiled. We felt untouchable again. That evening, the mood on board was almost festive. Mechanics cleaned the guns and repaired minor damage, humming songs from home. Pilots smoked on the deck, boasting about who had shot down more enemies. I sat with Mori, who scribbled in his logbook beside the railing. "It's too easy," he said quietly. "They're testing us." I wanted to argue, but couldn't. The Americans weren't fighting like before. They were probing, learning, adapting. They had failed this morning, but it felt like they had wanted to see how we would respond. We sent reconnaissance planes north and east, searching for the enemy carriers. They found nothing. "The Americans are running," one officer said proudly. I wrote in my notebook, "The war will end in 3 days." The words felt triumphant then, now they haunt me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ocean was too still, the silence too thick. I walked to the flight deck and watched the waves shimmer under moonlight. A few sailors were gathered by the rail, speaking in low voices. One of them said, "The sea is waiting for something." I almost laughed, but stopped myself. He was right. The water had that strange, expectant calm that comes before a storm. At 2,300 hours, a report arrived from one of our patrols, a brief flicker of static, then the words, "Possible enemy force sighted, bearing northeast." Before we could confirm, the signal vanished. Captain Aoki dismissed it as a mistake. "Probably shadows," he said. But I remember the look in his eyes as he said it, a brief flash of doubt. When dawn came, I watched the horizon again. It looked as peaceful as ever, painted gold by the rising sun. Yet deep down, I felt it, the ocean was lying. Something was coming, and it was already too late to turn back. The morning of June 4th began with sunlight, calm wind, and routine. At 4:30 a.m., the flight deck buzzed with activity. Mechanics fueled planes, deck crews armed torpedoes and bombs with the precision of ritual. The Akagi led the formation, proud and silent, while the sea reflected the pale glow of dawn. Everything seemed under control, almost beautiful. Then the alarm rang. "Enemy aircraft incoming!" The calm shattered instantly. We rushed to battle stations as the first wave of American torpedo bombers appeared low over the water. They came straight at us, slow and exposed, flying so low their bellies nearly kissed the sea. It looked suicidal. The Zeros launched to intercept, cutting through them like hawks through crows. One after another, the enemy planes exploded in the air or crashed into the ocean, leaving trails of smoke that smeared the horizon. Men on the deck cheered. "Fools!" someone shouted. "They can't even aim." For a moment, I believed it was over. The attack seemed pointless, desperate, an act of madness. But amid the cheers, I saw something odd. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave, even when none of them returned. They were dying to keep us busy. It didn't make sense, until I realized what they were doing. Above us, unseen and unchallenged, another formation was descending, fast and silent. The lookout screamed it almost too late, "Dive bombers!" Coming from the sun. I looked up and saw them, black silhouettes dropping out of the blinding sky, each one releasing a bomb before pulling up sharply. Time froze. The first explosion hit the Kaga. Fire erupted instantly, rolling across the deck like a living thing. The second struck the Soryu, tearing its hangar open in a single monstrous flash. The third came for us. The Akagi shuddered violently as the bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, where dozens of fueled planes waited for launch. The world turned orange. I was thrown to the ground, ears ringing, mouth filled with smoke. Flames licked across the steel. Pilots who moments before were boasting now screamed, their uniforms burning. The air was thick with the stench of gasoline and flesh. Through the chaos, I heard Mori shouting orders, trying to organize a response, but the ship itself was dying. From the bridge, Captain Aoki called for damage control, but the inferno had already reached the fuel lines. The deck bulged and split. Men jumped into the sea, their bodies turning into brief flashes of fire before vanishing into the water. Within minutes, the pride of the Imperial Navy was engulfed. The sky, once serene and blue, was now a canvas of flame and smoke. The sun had vanished behind it, swallowed by the war it had witnessed too long in silence. I realized then, the gods had turned their faces away. 10:20 a.m., that was the moment everything ended. The clocks aboard the Akagi stopped when the heat warped their gears. The air smelled of burning oil and blood, and the deck had turned into a furnace. I remember crawling through smoke so thick it felt like drowning on land. Men screamed names that vanished under the roar of exploding fuel tanks. The ship that once embodied the Empire's might was now a floating inferno. I reached the starboard side, where sailors were throwing buckets of seawater onto flames that laughed in their faces. A bomb had torn through the hangar, igniting rows of aircraft armed and ready for a second strike. The heat melted metal, and the wooden planks of the deck curled like paper. One of the mechanics, his skin hanging in strips, tried to drag a hose toward the fire. He collapsed before he reached it. I grabbed his arm, it came away in my hand. I froze. My mind went blank. All around me, the world dissolved into chaos. The Kaga was burning beside us, its munitions detonating in rhythmic thunder. To port, the Soryu was vomiting black smoke into the sky, a funeral pyre visible for miles. The ocean boiled where bombs had struck near the hulls. From the distance, the Hiryu was still untouched, still launching planes, unaware that it was now alone. I tried to reach the bridge, but the stairs were gone. A wall of flame blocked the path. Above me, the flight deck began to collapse, the steel supports screaming as they bent. I saw Captain Aoki emerge from the smoke, face blackened, uniform in tatters. He barked orders to abandon ship, though most of the crew were already dead or too injured to move. Someone shoved a life jacket into my hands, but I couldn't move. A voice called out, "Mori." He was covered in soot, dragging a wounded sailor toward the rail. "Help me," he shouted. Together, we pushed the man overboard into the sea. He hit the water and didn't resurface. Mori looked at me, eyes wild, and yelled, "Go! The ship's finished." I hesitated only a moment before jumping. The heat on my back was unbearable, the air itself was on fire. When I hit the ocean, it felt like diving into boiling oil. Around me, men thrashed, burning debris floating beside them. The sea itself was aflame, slick with fuel that turned the waves into ribbons of fire. I looked back once. The Akagi was unrecognizable, a mountain of smoke and flame devouring the sky. I realized it had taken less than 10 minutes for our pride, our power, our illusion of invincibility to die. 10 minutes, that was all it took to end the age of Japan's carriers and to baptize the Pacific in fire. I surfaced gasping, choking on oil and ash. Around me, the sea was alive with fire, ribbons of burning fuel spreading across the waves. The cries of dying men mixed with the groaning of the dying Akagi. The ship was tilting, her great hull glowing red beneath the smoke. I swam through floating wreckage, helmets, sandals, bodies, each wave bringing another face I almost recognized. The sky was dark now, heavy with smoke and ash that fell like snow. The sun had vanished behind our own ruin. Somewhere behind me, a secondary explosion ripped through the ship. The blast lifted me out of the water and threw me against a floating crate. My ears rang, my lungs burned. When I looked up, I saw the bridge collapse into the flames. The rising sun flag was still there, half-burned, fluttering weakly, defiant and pitiful. A motor launch approached, manned by survivors pulling others from the sea. I swam toward it, but a current of burning oil forced me back. A man beside me, his face gone, his eyes white, clutched my arm and whispered something I couldn't understand before slipping beneath the waves. I wanted to follow him, to let the ocean take me too. But instinct, or maybe cowardice, kept me afloat. When I finally reached the boat, 2 sailors dragged me aboard. We drifted away from the inferno in silence. None of us spoke. Some prayed, others simply stared, as if watching a god die. Then I heard a voice from the burning ship, Admiral Nagumo's, still shouting orders that no one could follow. His words were swallowed by the roar of fire. Moments later, someone said he'd gone below deck, choosing to die with the Akagi. Others followed his example, holding grenades to their chests, pulling the pins, vanishing in crimson mist. The ocean stank of oil and charred flesh. Every breath tasted of smoke. I watched men, officers, sailors, pilots, throw themselves into the flames rather than be rescued. They called it honor. I called it surrender. The boat drifted farther out. The Kaga was already gone, the Soryu sinking fast. Only the Hiryu still fought, sending her last planes toward the American carriers in a hopeless act of vengeance. The sea was filled with ghosts, our fleet, our pride, our illusions, all swallowed by the same indifferent water. As the sun finally broke through the smoke, I saw the reflection of the rising sun flag in the burning sea. It looked like blood spreading across the ocean. I realized then that the Empire was bleeding, too, proud, unbending, and slowly drowning in its own fire. I wanted to pray, but no words came. Only the hollow sound of waves against corpses, the last heartbeat of our pride. By nightfall, only the Hiryu remained. The other carriers had vanished beneath the waves, leaving behind oceans of smoke and silence. From our lifeboat, I watched her silhouette rise against the fire-lit horizon, proud, defiant, still alive. The crew aboard her refused to surrender. They would strike back, even if it meant nothing. The order came through the radio, all surviving aircraft to prepare for counterattack. Target, Yorktown. The words sounded hollow, desperate. Yet for a moment, they gave us something to cling to, the illusion that the Empire could still fight. We could hear her engines from miles away. Planes roared off the deck one after another, their trails glowing faintly against the smoke. Each one carried men who knew they would not return. I imagined their faces, calm, resolved, perhaps even smiling. I envied them. They still believed their deaths would mean something. Hours passed. Then, over the radio, came the report, direct hit on enemy carrier. Yorktown burning. A cheer rose from the lifeboat. For the first time that day, someone laughed. See, the gods haven't abandoned us. But as the laughter faded, the horizon flared again, brighter, hotter, deadlier. This time, the fire came for Hiryu. At 1,700 hours, American dive bombers found her. They came out of the clouds like judgment itself, diving straight through the smoke. I saw the explosions through binoculars, 4 perfect hits along the flight deck. Within minutes, the proud ship that had carried Japan's last hope was engulfed. Flames reached higher than her mast. Her planes, still being armed for a second strike, detonated like fireworks. The radio fell silent. Our boat rocked from the shockwave. Someone cursed, another began to cry. I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, covered in dried blood that wasn't mine. I realized I had stopped feeling fear. Only emptiness remained. The ocean that had once carried our empire now looked endless and cruel. When night fell again, the Hiryu still burned, a floating pyre surrounded by dying men. I watched until her lights disappeared beneath the black water. The sea hissed as the flames died, leaving only sparks on the waves, as if the stars themselves had fallen to watch our defeat. In 72 hours, the Empire of Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and thousands of men. But what truly died in those waters was our illusion of invincibility. The Pacific no longer belonged to us. The Americans had taken it, not through sheer numbers, but through patience, deception, and fate. As dawn approached, the sea finally calmed. The silence was unbearable. The waves carried wreckage, ashes, and pieces of dreams. I looked at the horizon where Hiryu had stood and whispered, "Forgive us." Because in that moment, I knew the truth. We hadn't lost a battle, we had lost the future. Days passed before we were found. A destroyer picked us up from the drifting wreckage, pulling us aboard one by one like broken shells washed ashore. The ship was overcrowded with survivors, burned, bandaged, silent. No one spoke about Midway. No one dared. The officers avoided our eyes, and even the sea seemed ashamed. I sat on the deck beside Mori, his hands trembling, eyes staring into nothing. When I asked if he was all right, he said only, "The sea took everything." And it had. On the 4th day, a message arrived from the flagship Yamato. The radio operator called for silence as he translated it. Operation cancelled. Fleet is to regroup and withdraw. The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. No explanation, no comfort, just retreat. I thought of all the men who had died believing we were winning, of the ships still burning beneath us. We had been told the Emperor himself blessed the operation. Now, the ocean was their grave and our shame. A few hours later, the Admiral himself appeared on deck. Yamamoto, the man whose name had become legend, whose strategy had built our victories. He looked older than his years, his uniform immaculate but his eyes hollow. The crew stood at attention, expecting words of defiance. Instead, he removed his cap and bowed his head. "The gods have tested us," he said softly, "and we have failed." No one moved. The only sound was the creaking of the ship. I had always seen him as unshakable, the architect of destiny. But that day, he was just a man, tired, grieving, haunted by the faces of the dead. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse the enemy. He simply looked toward the horizon where Midway lay and whispered, "It was my mistake. I underestimated them." Those words struck harder than any bomb. When he turned to leave, I saw tears glisten on his face. The officers pretended not to notice. No one saluted. We just watched in silence as he disappeared below deck, carrying the weight of our defeat like an anchor tied to his soul. That night, the wind was cold and merciless. The destroyer steamed west toward Japan, its lights dimmed to avoid detection. I stood at the stern, staring into the wake that trailed behind us, a foaming path of white dissolving into black. It felt like watching the last trace of the empire fade away. The radio continued to crackle with static, as if the sea itself were trying to speak. But there was nothing left to say. For the first time, I understood the true sound of defeat, not gunfire or explosions, but silence. Silence deep enough to swallow even the voice of a god. When we finally reached Tokyo Bay, the city did not welcome us as heroes. There were no bands, no flags, no cheering crowds. Only fog, and the quiet hum of engines as our battered ships crept into port. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, names once whispered with reverence, were gone. What returned to Japan was not a victorious fleet, but a ghost. The docks were lined with families waiting for loved ones who would never step ashore again. I watched as a woman held up a photograph of her son, calling his name into the wind. No one answered. The officers ordered us to remain silent about Midway. Official reports spoke of a temporary setback, a strategic withdrawal. Newspapers published maps showing the Pacific still painted red, as if the empire stretched unbroken across the ocean. Lies, printed in perfect calligraphy. We knew the truth, but the truth had become treason. Anyone who spoke of defeat was silenced. Even the radio broadcasts replaced the word loss with sacrifice. It was easier to bury the truth under words of honor than to face what we had done. I was sent to the naval hospital in Yokosuka for recovery. The wards were filled with men who no longer had faces, legs, or hope. Some whispered of Midway in the dark, saying the gods had turned away from Japan. Others cursed the Americans, the weather, fate, anything but themselves. But at night, when the lights went out, you could hear sobbing from every corner. I didn't pray anymore. I didn't believe the gods were listening. A few weeks later, we received letters to deliver to the families of the dead. Each one stamped with the seal of the emperor, each containing the same words, "Your son has achieved eternal glory in service to the empire." Glory, the most fragile illusion of all. I carried one such letter to the family of Lieutenant Mori. His mother bowed deeply when she received it, but her eyes never left mine. "Did he suffer?" she asked. I lied. I said he smiled as he died. She thanked me, and I hated myself for it. As summer turned to autumn, the fleet rebuilt in silence. New ships were laid down, new pilots trained. But the heart of the Navy had been torn out. The confidence that once filled our decks was gone, replaced by fear disguised as pride. We still saluted, still sang the anthem, still swore by the rising sun, but we all knew the truth. Midway wasn't just a defeat. It was the beginning of our unmaking. The empire didn't fall that day. It simply started to sink, slowly, quietly, beneath the same dark waters that had already claimed our pride. August 1942. The name Guadalcanal reached us like a rumor at first, a tiny island in the Solomon chain, barely a dot on any map. But soon, it became the center of every conversation, every strategy meeting, every nightmare. The Americans had landed there, building an airfield under our noses. It was unthinkable. Only 2 months had passed since Midway, and already the enemy was striking back. Yamamoto ordered an immediate counterattack. "We will drive them into the sea," he said. No one dared question him, but we all knew, the empire was no longer the hunter. It was the wounded beast. I was reassigned to a cruiser bound for the southern front. The sea around the Solomons was different, narrow, treacherous, filled with reefs and shadows. At night, the sky glowed red from distant battles. We called it Iron Bottom Sound, because every ship that sank there left its bones on the ocean floor. The Americans held the airfield, we held the night. Every day, their planes ruled the sky. Every night, our destroyers slipped through darkness to strike and vanish again. It was a new kind of war, one that felt less like strategy and more like survival. Our pilots were young, too young. Most had barely 100 hours of flight time. They went up against Americans who now flew better machines, faster, sturdier, deadlier. The Zeros that once dominated the skies were turning into coffins. Each mission ended with fewer planes returning. I stopped asking names, because remembering them hurt too much. The Tokyo Express, that's what the enemy called our nightly resupply runs. We carried ammunition, food, and men to Guadalcanal under constant bombardment. Many never reached shore. One night, our convoy was ambushed by American cruisers. Their radar found us long before our eyes could. The sea erupted in fire. Shells whistled through the dark like angry spirits. I saw a destroyer beside us vanish in an instant, one flash, then nothing. We fought blind, firing at silhouettes that disappeared between bursts of lightning. When dawn came, all that remained was smoke and drifting bodies. The newspapers back home called it the Battle for the Southern Islands. They said we were winning. But the truth on deck was different. Every victory cost us too much, every loss felt heavier than the last. We were burning through men faster than we could train them. The sea that had once obeyed us now swallowed us without hesitation. By December, the order came to withdraw from Guadalcanal. Officially, it was a strategic redeployment. We knew better. The Americans had dug in, and we had bled out. Midway had broken our carriers. Guadalcanal broke our spirit. I remember standing on deck as the last Japanese flag was lowered on that cursed island. The sky was gray, the wind silent. The empire that once dreamed of 1,000-year reign had begun to count its final days. The battles that followed Guadalcanal no longer felt like naval warfare, they were slaughter. The waters around the Solomon Islands became a floating graveyard. We called it the Sea of Graves, but the Americans named it more accurately, the Slot. Every night, we sailed into it, and every morning, fewer of us came back. The days of grand fleets and shining carriers were gone. Now it was chaos, destroyers clashing at point-blank range, torpedoes launched blindly, tracer fire slicing through darkness. The sea itself glowed red from burning ships. Our radar was primitive, theirs was godlike. We fired where we guessed the enemy was, but their shells always found us first. The night sky over Iron Bottom Sound never slept. I can still hear the sound, the thunder of explosions, the tearing of metal, the screams of men swallowed by fire and water. Sometimes we rescued survivors, but mostly we found corpses, bloated, silent, drifting face down under the moonlight. The ocean was no longer blue, it was the color of rust and blood. I served aboard the cruiser Otago then. Every man on board carried death in his eyes. We fought without strategy, without hope, only obedience. One night, we collided with one of our own destroyers in the dark. Flames engulfed both ships. I helped pull men from the water, their skin peeling from their arms. The next morning, we buried what remained at sea. The chaplain said the same. Words he had said 100 times, their souls now belong to the emperor. But even he no longer believed it. The Americans advanced relentlessly. Every island we took, they took back. Every plane we built, they built 10 more. We began sending inexperienced boys to the front, 17, sometimes 16 years old. They died before they ever saw the enemy's face. Some nights, I couldn't sleep. I would stand on deck, watching the horizon flicker with distant explosions, wondering how much longer the ocean would tolerate our arrogance. When orders came to escort another convoy through the slot, no one cheered. We went because that's what soldiers do, not out of honor, but habit. The battle that night lasted hours, maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. Searchlights cut through the dark like swords. I remember seeing a destroyer, one of ours, drifting aimlessly, aflame from bow to stern, its crew singing as it sank. Not hymns. Not prayers. Just songs of home. By the end of 1943, the navy that had once ruled the Pacific was broken. The few ships that survived carried the ghosts of 1,000 others. We didn't talk about victory anymore. We talked about endurance, how many more nights we could survive. The sea had taken everything, our fleet, our faith, our humanity. And still, it demanded more. When I closed my eyes, I saw only flashes of light and heard the endless chorus of the dying, their voices echoing across the black water. That was our lullaby now, the music of defeat, played night after night in the theater of blood. By 1944, the word kamikaze began to echo through the corridors like a prayer, or a curse. At first, it sounded poetic, divine wind, the same term used for the storm that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries ago. The officers spoke of it with pride, as if history itself would repeat the miracle. But this time, the wind came from our own wings. Young men turned into living weapons. They smiled as they climbed into their planes, engines roaring with what they called honor. I called it desperation. The war had become a ritual of death. The Americans were advancing from every direction, Saipan, Guam, the Philippines, and we were running out of everything: fuel, steel, pilots, faith. The skies that once belonged to our Zeros now swarmed with Hellcats and Corsairs. Their numbers were endless, their bombs unrelenting. The Imperial Navy was no longer a fleet, it was a graveyard pretending to float. Each mission ended the same way: smoke, silence, and empty skies. I was stationed at a base in Kyushu then, overseeing reconnaissance flights. Every morning, I watched boys no older than 17 bow before their commanders, recite their oaths, and climb into planes that would never return. Their families sent them white headbands marked with the rising sun. They waved as if heading to a festival, not to oblivion. One of them, a quiet boy named Hayashi, handed me his photograph before boarding. "So someone remembers my face," he said. I still have it, a ghost trapped in a smile. When the first kamikaze struck, the officers called it divine vengeance. Reports said a single pilot had sunk an American destroyer, killing hundreds. Tokyo radio turned it into legend. The people cheered, the emperor gave blessings, and new volunteers lined up the next morning. They said we had found a new weapon, the human spirit. But to me, it was proof that we had nothing left to fight with but death. At night, the airfields burned with the glow of departing squadrons. The engines howled like lost souls as they vanished into the darkness. Some planes never even found their targets, shot down or lost at sea before their final dive. Yet command kept sending them, one by one, wave after wave. Each man replaced by another who believed that dying beautifully was better than living to see defeat. I remember standing on the runway one evening, the sky streaked with fire from distant battles. A group of cadets saluted me before taking off. Their faces were serene, almost holy. When their planes disappeared over the horizon, I whispered, "There is no wind left, divine or otherwise." The next morning, reports came in, 3 ships damaged, 1 lightly burned. Tokyo called it victory. But all I saw was the empty runway and the echo of engines that would never return. The divine wind had blown, not to save Japan, but to scatter its sons across the sea like ashes. By late 1944, the empire was collapsing in slow motion. City by city, island by island, the fire spread. What began in the distant Pacific now burned at our doorstep. The Americans had taken the Philippines, and our once mighty fleet, rebuilt after Midway, reforged after Guadalcanal, was gone again, swallowed by the sea at Leyte Gulf. I heard the reports: carriers sunk, battleships burning, the ocean choked with oil and men. Yamamoto was long dead by then, shot down months earlier, his plane torn apart in midair. With him died whatever faith we still had. In Tokyo, the newspapers printed lies wrapped in poetry. "The emperor's will remains unbroken," they said. "Our sacred war continues." But the streets told the truth. Mothers digging through rubble, children lining up for rice that never came. At night, the air raid sirens howled like ghosts. The sky lit up with the fire of incendiary bombs. The same cities that had once glowed with lanterns now burned with a different light. From the hills, you could see Tokyo blazing, a storm of flame devouring its own heart. I was stationed near Nagoya then, coordinating transport convoys that never reached their destinations. American submarines prowled the waters like sharks. Every week another ship vanished, another crew gone without trace. We learned to stop asking why. Survival became mechanical: eat, breathe, obey. The Emperor's broadcasts grew quieter, his voice trembling through the static. "Endure," he said, "for the glory of Japan." But what glory remained in a nation of ashes? At night, the smell of burnt flesh drifted inland. It clung to everything: the wind, the rice fields, our uniforms. I could no longer tell if it came from the cities or from memory. The dreams were worse: the Akagi on fire, the screams at Midway, the faces of boys I'd sent to die. Every explosion overhead brought them back. Sometimes I woke thinking I was still in the water, surrounded by the dead, choking on oil and guilt. Rumors spread that the Americans were preparing to invade the home islands. Some prayed for one last miracle, others for death before dishonor. I prayed for nothing. I had stopped believing in miracles long ago. The rising sun flag still flew, but its colors had faded: crimson turned to rust, gold to gray. One morning, I walked through the ruins of Osaka. The streets were lined with corpses covered in blankets, the air thick with the stench of smoke and despair. A small boy stood beside his mother's body, holding a paper flag. He looked at me and said, "We'll win soon, right?" I couldn't answer. I just bowed and kept walking, the paper flag fluttering weakly in the wind behind me. That night, I stood by the harbor and watched the reflection of flames ripple across the water. It looked just like Midway, the same sea of fire, the same silence after the storm. And I understood: the war hadn't come full circle. It had never ended. It had only been waiting for us to burn the rest of the world before consuming ourselves. August 6, 1945. I remember the morning clearly, the heat already rising, the cicadas screaming in the trees. The war felt endless by then, a wound that refused to close. I was stationed in Kure, near the naval shipyards, when the message arrived: a single bomb has destroyed Hiroshima. At first, we laughed. It was impossible. One bomb couldn't destroy an entire city. We had seen air raids, thousands of bombs raining for hours, but one? The officers said it was American propaganda, another psychological trick. Then, as the day went on, the truth began to arrive, not in reports, but in fragments of horror. Trains from the West brought the survivors. They weren't people anymore, they were shadows in motion, skin hanging like rags, eyes clouded with white. Some carried children whose flesh had melted into their arms. Others walked barefoot, their bodies covered in glass dust that sparkled in the sunlight like snow. The doctors called it new fire. They didn't understand what had burned these people. There was no gunpowder, no napalm, no explanation. Only silence, and death that came days later in waves. When I was sent there 2 days later, Hiroshima no longer existed. The city had turned into a desert of ash. Buildings were flattened, bridges twisted into ribbons of steel. The river was filled with bodies, blackened, swollen, drifting slowly toward the sea. I walked through streets where no sound lived. Even the birds were gone. The only movement came from the wind, lifting the dust of what used to be life. And then I saw it, the shadow. On the wall of a bank, the shape of a man burned into the stone, frozen in the instant he ceased to exist. Around him, nothing but white. I stared at it for a long time, unable to breathe. The blast hadn't just killed bodies, it had erased souls. It was as if the gods themselves had turned to fire and decided humanity was no longer worth saving. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The same blinding light, the same silence after the roar. Rumors spread that the Americans had harnessed the power of the sun. Some said it was divine punishment, others, the end of the world. For me, it was the final proof that the war had become madness, a storm of fire consuming victors and victims alike. When I returned to Tokyo, the Emperor's palace stood untouched, but the rest of the city was ruins. The people no longer looked up when planes flew overhead. They simply waited. The air was heavy, the streets quiet, the nation hollow. I sat beside a radio in the barracks, listening to the static between broadcasts, and whispered to no one, "It's over." That night, I dreamed of the Akagi again, burning, sinking, disappearing beneath black water. Only this time, the sea glowed with the same white light that had erased Hiroshima. I woke with tears on my face, knowing the truth. We had finally found a weapon powerful enough to end war, by ending everything. August 15, 1945. The day the Emperor spoke. I was standing in the courtyard of what remained of the Naval Academy, surrounded by men who had once commanded fleets, now reduced to silence. The radio crackled with static before his voice came, soft, trembling, yet carrying the weight of centuries. He did not use the word surrender. He said only that the war had not progressed in our favor, and that we must endure the unendurable. Some men fell to their knees and wept, others stared at the ground, unable to accept that the divine voice they'd been taught to worship now sounded human, defeated, mortal. For me, it was not shock. It was relief. The war had finally exhaled its last breath. I walked to the harbor that evening. The sun was setting behind a haze of smoke that still hung over the ruins of Tokyo. Ships lay rusting in silence, their guns pointed uselessly toward the horizon. The sea, that old accomplice, was calm again, indifferent as ever. It had swallowed our enemies, our brothers, our pride, and now it reflected only light. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, there were no sounds of engines, no rumble of artillery, no orders shouted across the wind. Only the waves, soft and rhythmic, as if mourning. I thought of the men who had started it all, Yamamoto, Nagumo, Mori, the pilots of the Akagi, the boys of Guadalcanal, the kamikaze who vanished into smoke. I saw their faces in the reflection of the water, flickering like ghosts beneath the surface. I whispered their names, one by one, until the sound was stolen by the wind. The ocean did not answer. It never does. It only remembers. I picked up a piece of metal washed ashore, part of a plane's wing, its red circle still faintly visible. The rising sun faded to a pale wound. I ran my thumb over it and realized how small it was, how fragile. That symbol had once promised eternity. Now it was just rust and salt. I threw it back into the waves, and for a moment it floated, then sank without a trace. When night came, I sat on the pier, watching the moon rise over the black water. Somewhere far across that ocean were the men who had defeated us. I no longer hated them. We had shared the same madness, the same hunger for glory. They had burned our cities. We had started the fire. War had no victors, only survivors carrying ghosts. The sea was silent again, but it was not peace I heard. It was exhaustion, the deep, eternal sigh of a world tired of bleeding. I closed my eyes and saw the Akagi once more, her deck aflame, her crew disappearing into smoke. I understood then what Midway had meant. The true enemy had never been America. It was pride, our refusal to see the humanity beyond the flags. Now, when I look at the horizon, I see no borders, no nations, only water, endless, patient, forgiving. The sea has taken everything, yet it still gives back one gift, silence. And in that silence, I finally found something I had lost long ago. Not victory, not faith, but the courage to remember.